Please stand by. Good day and welcome to the Supervising Gang Members in Rural Communities audio teleconference webcast presented by the American Probation and Parole Association. This project is funded by an award from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice, to provide training to the probation and parole officers through distance learning methodologies. During this presentation, you will be able to pose questions to the trainer by pressing star 1 on your telephone keypad. This action will let the teleconference operator know that you have a question and will place you in a queue where you can continue to listen to the presentation without interruption. Your line will not be made live until the trainer indicates he is ready for questions, and the operator opens your line and announces you to the conference. You can then speak directly to the trainer. You also may submit questions online at any time by typing them in the space provided on your screen. The trainer will respond to those questions verbally during the announced question and answer periods and will respond to as many questions as time allows. Presenting today's training is Brian Perry. During his 30-year career with the California Department of Corrections, Mr. Perry worked as a parole agent, special agent, and chief of investigations. He retired in 2002 as the Assistant Director of the Law Enforcement and Investigations Unit, where he was responsible for gang suppression, intelligence and management, apprehension of paroled fugitives and escapees, officer-involved shootings, threat assessments, and other investigative duties. He has received 32 commendations from law enforcement agencies and received the Distinguished Service Medal on behalf of the unit's exemplary work during the 1993 Los Angeles riot. Mr. Perry has conducted trainings throughout the country on gangs and officer safety, and has been an expert witness and consultant for several agencies on gang-related issues. He also does work for the National Major Gang Task Force for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Sacramento and for the Sacramento County Probation Department. Mr. Perry, please begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry for the slight technical issues, but we have overcome them. I'm Brian Perry, and I'll be your presenter today. And before I begin the actual presentation, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the question and answer period. What we thought we would do about 45 minutes into the presentation, we'll pause and I'll take some questions for a period of time. And then we'll continue with the presentation. And then at the end of the slide presentation, at approximately 12:45 or so Eastern Standard Time, we'll take some additional questions up until the presentation is completed. So if everyone is okay with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Just to elaborate a little bit more on some of my background as it relates to you and your jobs. I was a state parole officer, state parole agent for 10 years. I didn't work in rural areas, but I worked in Los Angeles, and I worked in the East Los Angeles area, which was home of the Mexican Mafia prison gang, and today is a gang-infested area with Sureno gang members. I also worked for a part of my career in South Central Los Angeles, which was home of the Crips and the Bloods. That's where they began and expanded across the country from there. And today, South Central Los Angeles is a combination of Crips and Blood gangs as well as Surenos. So just a little bit of elaboration on some of my background. Let's go on here to training objectives. And throughout the course today, I'd like to identify the scope of the problem, and I can elaborate upon that, as well as we'll talk about gang definitions and the level of involvement of different gang members. Not everybody is committed to the gang as the hardcore members and leaders. We'll talk about the different types of gangs, from prison gangs to street gangs to tagger groups, and those types of gangs that you may have members on your caseloads. We'll also talk about the characteristics and methods of identifying gang members that different agencies are using across the country. I want to get into some safety and supervision issues, As my introduction stated, I do teach classes on safety, field safety, and office safety, and safety and supervision issues as it relates to gang members. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with some collaboration partnerships and working towards reducing gang violence and reducing the number of people that actually get into gangs. Big problem today. Let's look at gang perspectives. Every instructor has a different perspective. And where I'm coming from today is over almost 35 years of practical experience, both with juveniles. For a short while I did some consulting work with the California Youth Authority, which has been dubbed the most violent juvenile system in the country. But most of my experience has been with adults, adult parolees, and adult inmates. I get my national perspective from my involvement with the National Major Gang Task Force, and then that's a group of individuals that we have a gang coordinator from every state in the Union, plus Canada and Puerto Rico. And we exchange information about gang trends nationally. Of course, my expertise is in California gangs, so I will talk a bit about the California gangs as well as some of the major gangs across the country. And then my work with some of the professional organizations. I'm a volunteer with the Sacramento County Probation Department. So that's my perspective today, and that can vary from instructor to instructor. I learn as much from people in the audience, and I take that with me wherever I go. I do take the gang business very seriously. I've had 3 bona fide threats to my life. One of those threats was to my family. And I've had to relocate from Southern California to Northern California as a result. So I take the gang business very seriously, and I think if you're in the probation and parole business and you're supervising gang members, then you should take it very seriously as well. Let's talk about the collaborative approach. Gangs are on everybody's radar screen today. And this is society's problem. You know, these gang members came from someplace. They just didn't end up in jail and in prison and then out on probation and parole. This is truly a problem that society has to face today. And it's going to require a collaborative effort. It's just not a law enforcement, probation, parole, and courts problem. It's not a corrections problem or a community corrections problem. It's our problem as a society, and we're losing a large percentage of young people and young adults to the gangs, and we have to begin to take some efforts on the front end to reduce the lure or attraction of gangs, and some of that is going to be requiring a collaborative approach involving the communities, schools, faith-based groups, law enforcement, the courts, the departments of corrections, and of course the families. You can't get involved with gang members without getting involved in with their families as well. And as parole and probation officers, you're supervising adults that may be in gangs, or some of their family members may be in gangs. So we have to look at the entire umbrella of people that need to get involved with this entire gang problem. Let's go on here to gangs as a national epidemic. A very, very conservative approach to trying to catalog the number of gangs and gang members in the country. And this is the number I came up with from a couple of different federal organizations, and that's that there's about 30,000 gangs across this country with about 800,000 members. So you got anywhere from 800,000 to 1 million people involved in gang activity. And let me just read to you an excerpt from a Los Angeles Daily News article, and this was written about 3 years ago, but it's still very timely today. And it was part of an 8-part series about terror in our streets. And it states that in the past 5 years alone, gangs have been responsible for more than 3,000 homicides in Southern California. And at that time, it was more than the number of deaths in the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center, and 3 times the number of American lives lost in Iraq. Well, we know today that number of lives lost in Iraq is certainly up. But at this point in time, when this was written 3 years ago, we had 3,000 homicides. And what they said was the cumulative cost for these killings was an estimated $5.2 billion in revenue lost and taxpayer money spent for policing, prosecution, and incarceration. And I quote from the article, but the real costs can't be quantified. The toll on human lives, the suffering of families, and the dispiriting of entire communities where law and order no longer exists in any meaningful way. And then she went on to say that if there was a security alert, a national security alert for gangs, it would have been stuck on the red level for a very, very long time. So I mean, that kind of puts it in perspective exactly where we are. Now, the U.S. Attorney, Alberto Gonzales, prioritized the United States Attorney's Office, and there are 3 priorities for this year were terrorism, which we're all certainly alerted to, and the other 2 priorities were violence and gangs, and that you will be affected by if you're supervising gang members in your communities. And regardless of what state you live in or whether you live in an urban or a suburban area, certainly gangs are penetrating almost every fabric of our community. And as what we're learning more so now than before is a number of these gangs are migrating to rural areas, and this is where it directly impacts you and your work. We also want to talk about, you know, some people might try to characterize gangs as being a particular racial issue. And I can tell you from my experience that gangs cut across all racial lines and all ethnicities. We've got gang members of every color. So this is truly, in my estimation, a national epidemic. Let's talk a bit about the scope of the problem. Gangs are growing in numbers and influence. They're migrating to all areas, including the rural area where most of you work. They are responsible for the increase in violence. And where there's violence, there's going to be narcotics activity and vice versa, so they're certainly responsible for the increased narcotics trafficking. And the gangs across this country have been disrupting schools, the workplace, and the military. And we'll talk a little bit more about gangs in the military later on. And there's been a decrease in public safety and the quality of our lives. And as you working in rural areas, if you have an influx of gang members, you're going to see this firsthand. A decrease in public safety and a decrease in the quality of the lives of your community. And quite frankly, and sadly to say, that gangs are definitely becoming a lifestyle. Okay? Let's go on here to a short history of gangs. Gangs have been with us since the 19th century. You know, it started with the Irish ethnic gangs in New York, and then there was a migration westward to the larger cities, to Chicago, Los Angeles, and Denver. And then the immigrant gangs began to emerge again. And then there was an expansion of inner city gangs in Chicago with some of the black gangs emerging. And then on to Los Angeles and the West Coast. And in the late 60s, early 70s, the entire gang problem in Los Angeles expanded and exploded. And then we had the Crips and the Bloods. And I was a parole agent in those days, in the 70s, when we only had about 4 or 5 Crip sets and about 4 or 5 Blood sets in the city of Los Angeles. And we watched the Crips and Bloods expand throughout California and absolutely across this country. We have Crips and Blood sets in almost every state across the country. So this is really, really expanded. Urban street gangs, you know, out here we call them urban terrorists because that's exactly what they are. There's also been an emergence in some of our larger prison systems with prison gangs. In California, we've been struggling with prison gangs for 4 or 5 decades. They started in the late 50s, and were basically for about 10 years we denied we had gangs. We fell 10 years behind, and we have never caught up. And of course, what we've had nationally in some of the larger prison systems is the prison gangs direct the street gangs, and this is how it's going to affect you as well. There's been plenty of gang migration, and we'll talk more about that on another slide. And there's been some prison gang migration as we began to federalize a lot of state crimes. More and more people are going to federal prison. More and more gang members are going to federal prison, and they're getting dispersed across the country. So by the sheer fact of federalizing laws, we're beginning to see a prison gang migration across the system. And of course, we've always had outlaw motorcycle gangs, and we'll talk a little bit about them as well. Okay. Moving along, let's talk about the definition of gangs. Lots of different jurisdictions have different definitions, but in my research and in my dealings with departments across the country, this is basically a basic definition of a gang. It's a group of 3 or more persons with a common identifying sign, symbol, or name, engaged either individually or collectively in a pattern of crime. And it creates an atmosphere of fear and intimidation in the community. So that basically is a definition that anybody can use. And I think the FBI and some of the federal agencies use a very, very similar definition. Now, I know you all supervise adults, but some of the background, some of these adults that you're supervising now join gangs as juveniles. So I want to just take a couple of slides and talk about why people join gangs and a sense of belonging. I've talked to literally thousands of adult and juvenile gang members and asked them why they joined gangs, and I can tell you, definitely a sense of belonging. That's something that everybody has a need for the sense of belonging. So what happens is the family becomes, or the gang becomes the surrogate family. Acceptance and sense of identity, a very, very strong pull. And we all know that acceptance is very important to all of us. Self-esteem. Most of these gang members had very, very low self-esteem, and they thought by joining a gang that it would increase their self-esteem. Protection and peer pressure. No doubt in my mind that protection, they join a gang for protection. And of course, as young adults and juveniles, the peer pressure is certainly a very, very strong pull. Money and financial gain. That tends to lure people into gangs as well through the sale of drugs. And of course, the media has glamorized gangs. There's been a number of movies out there, particularly in the last 10 years, where they glamorize gang, and you get a lot of young people that want to get into gangs for the excitement or what they see as excitement. And of course, in some of the areas that have had gangs for quite a while, we're into multi-generational gangs. In California, we've got 2nd and 3rd generation gang members. So it's a family history. So quite frankly, why gangs? I'll be accepted. People will fear me. I will feel accepted. That feeling is very, very strong. I can get easy money through drug sales, and someone always has my back. That's the protection aspect of it. Quickly, some of your adult probationers and parolees, when they were youth, and if they decided to join a gang at that particular time, the profile for young people that join gangs today is very, very clear. Poor social skills, no role models in their family, no role models in their extended family, no work skills, generation of welfare recipients, low education, low reading, low ability to read. At home, low expectations of themselves and others, if there were any expectations at all. And certainly, we talked about it before, negative peer influence. and very few positive strokes at home. So this is a recipe for disaster and why people began to get into gangs. Let me just see what we have here. Let's talk about the myths of gang culture. Protection. I'll get into a gang for protection, but as you know, and I know, many gang members end up getting injured, stabbed, shot, sometimes killed, or end up in county jail or prison. Okay, so that's really a myth for wanting to join a gang. Belonging to a family? Come on, what family member in their right mind would direct their other family members or young people to use drugs, commit crimes, and to injure other people? So another myth that the gang becomes the surrogate family. And respect, which is very big with gang members. And what gang members do is they mistake or confuse fear for respect. They want people to fear them, and they think that's what gains the respect. But as you and I know, that people gain respect by treating others well. And this is something that gang members have a hard time understanding. Some of the gang truths across this country, and I'm sure most of your adult probationers and parolees experience some of these as young people, that youth become homicide victims, particularly in inner cities. Youth commit suicide, big problem. Youth get arrested for violent crimes, and gang members get arrested 10 times more than non-gang members. They drop out of school. We have babies having babies, teen mothers and fathers having children. And we know that every day in America, we've got gang members and young people ending up in jail or prison or on probation or on parole. And then you get them to supervise them, and with your dual role of public protection and attempting to help these people turn their lives around. And with gang members, the problem is just that much more complicated because of the lure of gangs. One of the things that we're going to talk about the different types of gangs out there, as I mentioned before: street gangs, prison gangs, party crews, tagger crews, outlaw motorcycle gangs, and female gangs, which are definitely on the rise today. Let's talk about different levels of involvement, and these are the types of questions that you need to ask your probationers and parolees, those that are involved in gangs. It's just how far involved and how deeply involved are they? You know, sometimes they'll talk about it and sometimes they won't. Sometimes you'll have to gain this information from collateral contacts with family members and law enforcement officers. But are they leaders or shot callers? And you're usually going to know that. And then are they hardcore members? Because these are the most problem probationers and parolees we're going to have. Associates and affiliates. We've got a group of people that might be on up status. They want to be in the gang. They just haven't earned their right to get there yet, or they're having to put work in to get into the gang. And gang members get jumped in, or they have to put work in, do some work for the gang to become a member. And then there's a lot of young people and a lot of young adults that are on the fringe of this problem today. And we call them marginal members. They don't know what they want to be. So you've also got, unfortunately, what we call torpedoes. Those are people that will do anything for the gang. And those are the people that the gangs use to commit violent crimes and to injure others, and then they basically are cast aside. And all too often, these young gang members become the torpedoes, because many times the older adult gang members know that sometimes the criminal justice system is easier on juvenile and younger people than they are on the older ones. And of course, we got the wannabes, and there's no shortage of people that want to get into gangs today. So those are the different levels of involvement that you should be looking at as you supervise your probationers and parolees. Let's talk a little bit about gang identifiers. Some of the things that you need to learn these identifiers for the different gangs that may be operating or moving into your area. Certainly colors. And this can be deceiving, so you really kind of have to learn a bit about this, because not all Crips use the color blue, and not all Bloods use the color red. But certainly tattoos, learn prison tattoos or gang tattoos, and these are things that you need to ask people when they come in under your supervision, whether they're coming from a county jail or directly from court, or they're being paroled from a prison, is talk to them about their tattoos and what do those tattoos mean. And certainly we know from at least our prison side of it is watching people in prison, the way they posture and stand, walk. There's an arrogant gait about themselves. Hand signs. Gangs flash hand signs to identify themselves to others. And you might see some of that during the course of your supervision. Drawings and artwork. That is, you see that a lot in prison, and you will probably see some of that during your parole searches and your probation searches. Drawings and artwork that may indicate that that particular parolee or probationer are involved or is involved in a gang. Certainly clothing today, sports apparel and jewelry. A lot of these gangs adopt sports apparel as their clothing for their particular gang. And those are the things that you're going to have to learn about and ask about. Those are legitimate questions to be asking probationers and parolees. Why do you wear a particular color outfit, and what does that mean? And then, of course, reading graffiti. We have plenty of graffiti in the urban areas and suburban areas, and I would assume that as the gangs begin to migrate into the rural areas, one of the first things you're going to see is graffiti, and you have to learn to read the graffiti. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. Okay, let's talk about gang migration. Oh, here's some additional identifiers. These are mostly the in-custody types of identifiers, but these are the things that you may come across if you're out doing a parole search or a probation search. And these are some of the things you should look for if you know your probation or parolee is involved in a gang. Written material and letters from prison. You might come across a letter where a prison gang leader is directing your parolee to commit a certain crime or to do some gang business for their gang. So look for jail and prison correspondence. Group photographs. Gang members love to take photographs of themselves. So you certainly want to, when you're searching, to be alerted to group photographs. And then ask your probation or parolee, who are these people in this group photograph and what gang do they belong to? Gang rules, codes, and constitutions. And we'll talk about this as we get into the presentation. A lot of these sophisticated gangs have very elaborate codes, constitutions, and rules, and they love to write about it. So you need to look for these things when you're doing your searches. Certainly visitors lists and trust accounts, if you have any of those coming directly out of the county jail. We like to look at trust accounts of gang members to see who's sending money in and who they're sending money out to, because that shows us who their associates are. And you certainly have to be aware of turf behavior and hangouts. Gangs tend to like to claim turf as theirs and hang out in particular areas. And you need to know that for your own safety when you're out doing field supervision. And certainly a very good way to learn about identifiers and learn more about the gangs in your area, the collateral contacts with the local police in your area. Okay, let's talk about gang migration. How do these gangs, end up migrating to rural areas? Well, I can tell you, these are the 2, 4, 6 reasons that I've found over the years. And one is relocation of families. You got families that say, you know what, I want to get my family, my either young adults, out of this area because it's gang infested, so they move to a different area, suburban or rural area. The problem with that is many times you can take the gang member out of the hood, but you can't take the hood out of the gang member. And they end up coming to a new area, a rural area, and what they want to do is recruit other people into their gang. Another one is avoiding apprehension and prosecution. They commit crimes in other areas, and they flee the area to avoid apprehension and prosecution. Sometimes they'll flee the area to avoid retribution of rival gangs. A lot of drive-by shootings, and there's always retaliation with the gangs. And sometimes some of these folks will leave the area to avoid the retaliation. Certainly, expansion of drug markets, very, very big. And that's what caused the Crips and Bloods to move across the country, was to expand the drug market. And certainly, some of the Chicago-based gangs, the People Nation and the Folk Nation and the Almighty Latin Kings, they expanded drug markets, and that's why they moved across the country. Limited law enforcement resources and gang awareness. We talk to people that have moved into rural areas, and that's what they think. They're escaping law enforcement scrutiny and large police and sheriff's departments by going to a rural area. And of course, we talked about this, just touched on it a little earlier, incarceration in federal prisons. And what happens is, as I said, they're federalizing crimes. More and more gang members are going to federal prisons. And let's say they're originally from Arizona, and they get placed in a federal prison in North Carolina. Well, their family may come to move there to facilitate visits. And when they move there, sometimes the gang follows. So that's some of the reasons we have some of the gang migration. We're going to talk about these major street gangs that are pretty well spread across the country, and I hope to hit all of your areas. The Surenos, which started in Los Angeles with the 18th Street gang, very notorious gang, and now we have Surenos all across the country and in Puerto Rico as well. Nortenos, which were the arch rivals of the Surenos, we've got Nortenos all across the country. Of course, Crips and Bloods, Latin Kings, and the other Chicago-based gangs, they've spread out across the eastern seaboard into the southern United States and throughout the Midwest. And of course, one of the most frightening gangs we have up on the radar screen today is Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. And they are getting a lot of publicity in the last 6 months to a year as being one of the most vicious and violent gangs across the country, and they are expanding. And then we're going to talk about the Skinheads and some of the white supremacy movement and some of that's going on across the country, because we have had a real explosion or expansion of white supremacy gangs all across the country, not only in urban and suburban, but into rural areas. So we're going to touch upon them. So let's go in and let's talk a little bit about Surenos. Basically, most of the Sureno sets will identify with the color blue. You'll see 13 tattooed on them many times, and 13 is going to stand for the 13th letter of the alphabet, which is M, either for the fact that they use marijuana, or that if they're from the western United States, they probably identify with the California Mexican Mafia. Because in California, the Mexican Mafia controls all Sureno gangs. The Surenos are basically the junior varsity, for lack of a better term, for the Mexican Mafia. The largest Sureno gang at one time was the 18th Street, which was comprised of many Mexican nationals, and here you can see this tattoo here, West Side 18th Street, and the LA tattoo. And then a very popular tattoo for Surenos is the Sur, S-U-R, which stands for Southerner. So very, very prominent across the country, and you should be asking any of your gang members or any of your probation or parolees, if they have these types of tattoos, you need to ask them about it and what it means. Let's talk about the Nortenos that are spread across the country. And originally they were formed, the original Norteno gang was called the Northern Structure, and was formed in California in the mid-'80s. So they've been around a long time. And originally they, basically what happened was, there was a crackdown on a prison gang called the Nuestra Familia. And when they all got locked up, They needed somebody to continue to commit crimes in the community and to commit crimes on the general population yards of prisons. So they formed the Northern Structure, which blossomed into the Nortenos. And the Nortenos are infamous for lots of different writing. They have their own bonds, which is like a constitution. They have education programs for their members where if they're caught sleeping or they don't have their shoes on when they're in a cell, they'll have to write an essay about how to stab an opponent and where to stab them to incapacitate them at one strike. They tend to have a rank structure and send their information up and down through a series of channels and filters, which are different people. Some of their tattoos, as you can see, is the 14th, because the 14th letter of the alphabet is N. And in Spanish, NA is for the letter N. Some of them identify with the Northern Star for Norteño, and then the block letters XIV for 14, which is what they identify with. Let's go on to the Crips and Bloods. The Crips started in the 70s, and they were primarily in South Central Los Angeles. And now we have about 50,000 members of the Crips in California alone, and they have absolutely spread across this country. And as you can see in some of their graffiti, they refer to Bloods as slobs, and then they will cross out the B because of the B stands for Bloods. The 187 is the Penal Code section in California for homicide. They like to use that in their graffiti. And then you can see this tattoo of Hoover. Hoover is a street in Los Angeles, and there's about 30 different Crip sets that identify with the Hoovers. But these Crips have migrated absolutely all across this country, and we have Crips being identified in every state, and we have Crips of different ethnicities. We have white Crips, we have black Crips, we have Hispanic Crips. They like to use BK, which is blood killer, and they like to refer to themselves as Cuz. They're arch enemies of the Bloods, and of course they're involved in narcotics trafficking, which actually brought them across the country. They are involved in some legitimate businesses where they launder their money. They're heavily involved in the music industry, and they're heavily involved in takeover-type robberies of gambling casinos out here in the western United States. Let's talk about the Bloods. They identify with the color red, and there are certainly more Crips than Bloods in California, but my research tells me there are more Blood sets across the country than there are Crip sets. And Bloods tend to identify and align themselves with one another, where a lot of Crip sets fight one another. And a lot of Blood sets will identify with some of the disciples of the People of Nation in prison and some of the Chicago-based gangs. But Bloods are very, very prominent across the country, and they have very, very distinctive tattoos. Let's talk about the almighty Latin Kings. As you know, they originated in Chicago, and then they migrated to the East Coast, to the Southeast, and to the Southwest region of the United States. The Latin Kings, we've got Latin Kings all over. We know there's at least 30 chapters in 34 different states. They affiliate themselves with the People Nation, and their arch enemies, of course, are the Folk Nation. Highly structured, very well organized. They have an indoctrination ceremony. They've got a very elaborate constitution, bylaws. They have an oath that they require members to take. They identify with the five-pointed jewel crown. They have numerous symbols to signify their relationship to the gang. Some of their colors, but don't get hooked on colors because colors change, but they typically wear black and gold or yellow or sometimes red or green. So that's the Latin Kings that have spread all over the country. The People Nation is kind of an umbrella group. It started in Chicago. It was many, many gangs and sets, and of course some of their sets are the Black P-Stones, the Latin Kings, the El Rukins, the Vice Lords, and many of the others. And you'll see many, many different sets identifying with People Nation. They have their own philosophy, and it's all for one, or one for all. Their code of conduct is gang before family. Numerous symbols where they use the 5-point star, and they tend to have a left identifier. So look for probation or parolees that use left-hand signs. Sometimes they roll up their left pant leg. They will tilt their hat to the left. They wear jewelry to the left, or they'll walk with their left hand in their left pocket, or they may leave their left shoe untied. That's kind of the People Nation and some of the identifiers to look for with them. Now the Folk Nation, which is their arch rival, once again, numerous symbols. They use the 6-point star, or the 6-point pitchfork, or the 6-pointed winged heart, or the number 6. And of course they use, opposite of People Nation, they use right identifiers, whether it's the hat, the pant leg, or jewelry. Okay, let's move on to the MS-13. Stands for Mara Salvatrucha. They originated in El Salvador during the Civil War in El Salvador was between 1981 and 1992. And what happened is a lot of people from El Salvador migrated to the Los Angeles area. And they originally joined the 18th Street gang, but then they had a problem with the 18th Street gang, and there was a split, and they formed their own gang. And then once the Civil War was over, many of them got deported back to El Salvador, and what happened was they went back now as sophisticated gang members and started causing problems in El Salvador, and this gang has grown tremendously. And they've recruited other immigrants from neighboring countries of Guatemala and the Honduras. So this here has become one of the major problems across this country, and you're going to see them migrating to the rural areas as well. Let's touch on the skinheads, and then we'll take a break for some quick questions here, because I've got almost 12:20. Skinheads originally began in England, and once they got here, many of the skinhead groups adopted a racial philosophy, but there are some skinhead groups that are not racially oriented. We have found that many of these groups are not turf-oriented, but not well organized beyond their local region. Most of the skinhead groups and white supremacy groups have certainly evolved into a racist philosophy, and we've seen a lot of groups align themselves with the white Aryan resistance movement that was started in Oregon. Here in California, Public Enemy #1, Peni, is a skin group that is up on radar screen, and we know they are migrating through the far west, and we have gotten some Public Enemy #1 in the Midwest as well. So if you're working in a rural area and you see somebody come in with that type of a tattoo, you might want to ask them about it. I think this would be a good time to take a pause and take any questions. Pat Bancroft, can you help me out with that?
At this time, I have received no questions over the web.
Okay.
The operator should let you know whether there are any questions in the queue.
If you would like to ask a question over the phone, you may do so by pressing the star key followed by the digit 1 on your touch-tone telephone. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. Once again, please press star 1 on your touch-tone telephone to ask a question. And there are no questions at this time, Mr. Perry.
Okay, we'll entertain some questions at the end of the presentation as well. Let's move on to some general information about gangs. We talked about this before. Gang members are 10 times more likely to get involved in serious incidents and crimes, and you need to know that if you're supervising gang members, because that's a very relevant fact today. General gang information: gangs are continually changing. They adapt faster than law enforcement can change because the rules of engagement are different for them. You've got to know that gangs have shaky agreements and fleeting alliances between themselves, and that can change at any time. They can get into an argument over gang turf or a drug deal, and gangs that were once aligned could become rivals, and you need to know that for your own personal safety, particularly when working in the field or when you have probationers or parolees coming to the office, and you want to be careful about having opposing gang members in the office at the same time. No longer blood in and blood out. In the old days, you had to shed some blood to get into a gang, and there was no retirement plan. There was no way to get out of the gang other than get yourself killed. Many gang members today are being recruited for their skills. A meth cooker, methamphetamine, a very popular drug across this country. Gang members are being recruited for their ability to sell narcotics, entrepreneurs, and today, probably more so than anything else, for their computer skills. If you see some of these gang sets, they have their own websites and their MySpace pages, and they're very elaborate. And we'll talk more when I talk about safety, about their ability to locate you and your home address through computers. So it's a difficult time to be supervising probationers and parolees who are involved in gangs because they're continually changing. This slide represents kind of the evolution of gang members. Many times you get this particular person. His name is Kody Scott. His nickname is Monster Kody Scott. He started out as an 8-tray gangster crip on the streets of Los Angeles. He went to prison and became a member of the BGF, which stands for the Black Guerrilla Family. And then after he wrote a best-selling book, The Autobiography of L.A. Gang Member, he kind of saw himself as a black revolutionary. In fact, he was a parolee at large, a parole absconder for the last couple of months, and just got arrested here in California for about the 5th or 6th time. And one thing I caution people who work in the field is that the gang members get younger and you get older. So you need to keep yourself mentally and physically in good shape. Gang operations, many times what we have is the dominant gangs will tax the weaker gangs for their drug sales. And we've known some of the taxing will go on for anywhere from $500 to $3,000 per month. Street crews will operate in different areas to commit armed robberies for the gang and also do drug rip-offs, which is very common and also causes a lot of problems between gangs. We also know that some street crews will do contract hits for prison gang members, where the prison gang leaders will direct street crews to maybe assault or try to kill an informant. Extortion and protection are big with gangs. They will extort money from store owners in particular areas in order to protect them. Gangs are known to run prostitutes as well. And we had interviewed one restaurant owner who was being extorted by a gang in the California, in the Los Angeles area for $15,000 a month. So it can get very, very pricey. Let's talk about gang funerals. Although you may not work them, police agencies like to work gang funerals because they provide information about who the leaders are by watching who's respected and who isn't. But one of the things about gang funerals is it's a reminder that many gang members don't expect to live long. When you interview some of these people, the hardcore gang members, they know that they're going to be involved in violent confrontations. And in their words, they live fast. They're about guns, narcotics, and violence. And unfortunately, that attitude that life is cheap is a very dangerous attitude for you as public safety officers and for the public. So many times, surveillance at gang funerals provides quite a bit of information about who's who in that particular gang. Let's talk a little bit about gang recruitment. As we know, gangs are recruiting younger and younger people. It's a sad state of affairs. We've already talked about gangs. We're into second and third generation of gangs. And if you see a gangs move into your area, you can best bet they're going to start recruiting, and they're going to start with the younger people. So, gangs are clearly, in this country, in many of the large urban areas, have become a way of life. They have their own music, their own clothes, and their own websites. And if we're going to break the cycle of gangs, we're going to need to spend some money in the front end. We're going to hit upon some of the major prison gangs that are out there, and what we're finding is the prison gangs direct the street gangs. So we'll talk a bit about the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and every state's got their own version of the Aryan Brotherhood. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Black Guerrilla family, the Nuestra Familia, Neta from Puerto Rico that is now in the United States, the Asian gangs, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Border Brothers or the Mexican national gangs. Mexican Mafia, which was started in the 50s in California, spread from behind the prison walls out to the streets. Now they control almost all of the criminal activities in the streets of Southern California by controlling the Surenos. Okay, the Mexican Mafia has expanded through the western United States, and we have a number of Mexican Mafia members in the Federal Bureau of Prisons and in prison sites in many other states across the country. And although they're certainly not the largest gang, they're one of the most influential prison gangs in this country, and they are growing rapidly. Like I said, they started in the early 50s, and they control activity both inside the prisons and outside the prisons. Let's talk about the Aryan Brotherhood. Same thing. The original Aryan Brotherhood was formed at San Quentin Prison in California, and then they expanded to many other state prison systems, and almost every system that I'm aware of have some form of the Aryan Brotherhood, whether they're called the Aryan Nation or the Aryan Resistance or the Aryan Family. And most of these groups started with a racial philosophy. But I've got to tell you, they've gone beyond the racial philosophy. They'll do business with minorities, with blacks and Hispanics, if there's money involved. And for years, the Aryan Brotherhood actually was allied with the MA, or what we refer to as the Mexican Mafia. And of course, most of the white groups, their arch enemies are the black or African American gangs. But we have got Aryan Brotherhood and white supremacy gangs in every prison system across the country. And they're known for overkill, very much like the La Cosa Nostra. They tend to overkill their victims. And we've attacked these white gangs and the Aryan Brotherhood and some of these prison gangs through the RICO, the racketeering federal prosecution tactic. Because most of these gangs fall within the criteria for racketeering, and we've had some success with prosecuting them. One of the other prison gangs that's growing rapidly in the western United States, and we're beginning to see it migrate into the Midwest, are the Nazi lowriders. And they were also formed as the junior varsity for the Aryan Brotherhood. They went kind of defunct in the 70s, but when the Aryan Brotherhood got locked up in management control units and security housing units, they resurrected the Nazi lowriders to commit crimes on the streets. And the Nazi lowriders actually became their own gang and now are migrating to other states. They have a rank structure, and they are being a faction of the Nazi lowriders are actually directed by the Aryan Brotherhood. But in some of the western United States, they're a standalone gang all by themselves. They're known to be very violent towards law enforcement, parole, probation, and police officers. There's just a tattoo. They definitely have gone after some of their own. And here was an individual that turned state's evidence and ended up getting his throat slit as a result of it. The Nuestra Familia was started in California and then spread to the Federal Bureau of Prisons as a result of some prosecutions. And they were the group that started the Nortenos. As I talked about earlier, when we locked a number of the Nuestra Familia up in the early 80s, They formed their own junior gang, the Northern Structure, which became Nortenos, Nuestra Raza. They go by different names. But they, once again, like the almighty Latin kings, they have a very, very extensive written constitution, bylaws, etc. We just recently sent 4 leaders of the Nuestra Familia to Federal Bureau of Prisons again, and they're housed at the ADX facility in Florence, Colorado. And we're hoping that they do not expand beyond where they are today. Let's talk about NETA. NETA is a gang that began in Puerto Rico, and it spread to the United States. We've got chapters in the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Great Lakes region. Very well organized. They've got a rank structure, and they're known for assaults, drug activity, home invasions, extortion, the full gamut of crime. And one of their identifiers is they wear the beaded rosary like a necklace. Asian gangs tend to be young, 13 to 25 years old, very, very mobile, small in numbers, but it is growing. The Asian gang problem is growing, and we've known them to be nomadic. They'll commit a crime on the West Coast, and they'll migrate to the Midwest and hide out with other known Asian gangs. We've known them to go to rural areas to hide out. They're very difficult on their own. They tend to victimize their own with home invasion robberies. They can be very well educated. Our staff have followed gang members, Asian gang members to college in the day, and they would be out committing crimes in the evening. So very different. We don't know, we're just learning, we're just getting some experts across the country on Asian gangs, but they're definitely growing across the country. And some of their common tattoos are the eagles and the dragons. So if you've got some Asian gang members on your caseloads, you need to ask them about some of those tattoos and who they belong to and where their relatives are, because if they abscond, the chances are they're going to leave your area and go to another state. Let's talk about what's known as the Border Brothers. They're predominantly Mexican nationals, and they refer to themselves as Border Brothers. And we've got 25,000 of them locked up in California. We've got 175,000 inmates in the California State Prison System. 25,000 are Border Brothers and Mexican nationals, and they've kind of formed their own gang. And they many times will align with Surenos. In Texas, they are definitely at war with the Texas-based gangs. And they're there's a large contingent of Mexican nationals who have formed their own gangs in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They have a large problem with them. And they tend to prey on themselves as well, much like the Asians do. So they're definitely on the rise, and they're spreading across the country. And many times they'll go into rural areas to work in the agricultural fields. So you may see an influx of them coming your way. I jumped ahead. Let's go to motorcycle gangs. In every state, you all got them, and they tend to like to go to rural areas on their runs and camp in rural areas and party in rural areas. So if you've got any of the motorcycle gang members on parole or probation, you need to be talking to them about their affiliations, their tattoos. These guys are known to deal in narcotics and guns and stolen motorcycle parts. And a lot of these gangs don't get along. And some will patch over, what they call patching over, and become affiliates with the larger gangs. And we've got a lot of problems across this country between the war between the motorcycle gangs. So if you got any on your caseloads, you're going to need to talk about who their rivalries are, so who their rivals are, so you can operate effectively in the office. You don't want opposing gang members showing up at the office at the same time. You don't want a problem in your parking lot or in the office itself. Female gangs growing, a growing menace across the country. In California, we had 11,000 women locked up in our state prison system. They weren't gang members, but we're seeing an increase in female gang members, and an increase in violence. In the past, they used to hold the guns and hold the narcotics for their male counterparts. Today, we've got females going to prison and being put on probation for more violent crimes. They're shooters today, not just holding the gun, and they're certainly dealing narcotics today. We know the female gang members as great communicators. They exchange mail. They work as mail drops for their male counterparts, and we refer to them as the switchboard operators for the gangs. They will run three-way telephone calls for the gangs. So this is another growing problem, along with the Asian gangs. The impact of prison gangs on street gangs. There is definitely an impact. In most of your major metropolitan areas and states with large prison populations, you're going to see the prison gangs direct the street gangs and direct street crimes. They tend to have street crews that will run the extortion, the prostitution, any of the violent crimes, and there is a direct correlation between prison gangs and street gangs in most states. Okay, let's talk a little bit about prison gang operation. Communication is the lifeblood. They can direct street gangs right from their prison cells, or what we call security housing units. Some of the most formidable lockup units in this country have gang members who plot, plan, and organize street gangs in the community. Talk about communications. Through written correspondence, they're known to use coded written messages. Some of these gang members are sophisticated enough to use different alphabets. The Aztec and Runic alphabets are known to be used by Hispanic and white gangs. They use a series of mail drops, where they'll mail a letter out to a residence. That person will re-envelope it and mail it into another gang member. Take a minute and this is a simple code. If you just take a minute and read that letter, and then I'll show you the code that's written in there. Seems like a simple enough letter as you read it. But here's the code. The number 8 is underlined, so every 8th word is the meaning. Peel, shady, cap, giving up info, end. So obviously Shady is working as an informant, or they suspect he's working as an informant, and they want his cap peeled, meaning they want him hurt. They want they want somebody to assault him. So these are the way they write some of their communication in everyday letters. Very, very elaborate. Some of these gangs write in mini writing, and you can see it here. Disciplines. The gang wants these particular individuals disciplined. Hard candy or personal. These are some of the people that they want assaulted. These individuals are given passes. So they will communicate with what they call kites or mini writing. Shot callers in prison will call the shots out in your communities as well. They control and organize prison yards, and they control and organize street crime as well. Let's talk about some gang supervision. This is important. You got to know the gang status of your probationer or your parolee. Knowledge is power. The more you know about them, the safer you're going to be. You got to know the characteristics of the gangs in your area and the gang members on your caseloads. Many times you're going to have those gang members under closer supervision. You may have special conditions of parole and probation, such as no gang association, no flying of colors, or some kind of injunction where they can't hang out at certain places. Again, you've got to use caution during your home visits, because if your probation or parolee is not a gang member, they may have gang members living in their homes. So you've got to be aware of the gang members and their rivalries. You certainly want to be careful about having rival gangs in the office. And if you have the arrest powers and search powers, if you're going to go and have to deal with an arrest or search of paroled or gang members on probation, you certainly want to take adequate law enforcement backup. And certainly your allies in this are certainly the police agencies that are out there. You've got to share information with police agencies. Let's talk a little bit about interviewing skills. One thing I've learned about gang members is don't threaten. Gang members don't like to, if you begin to threaten gang members, they take it personal, and when they begin to take it personal is when the threats come. Okay? Many of these people are very comfortable in jail and prison. That's their homes. Many of them are state raised. They've been raised their entire life in these lockup units. So then you can't threaten them with jail or prison because they're comfortable there. That's where their other gang members are. Okay? Let's talk about don't demean. That'll get you nowhere. Shut things down. I know you've got a lot of training in communication because your ability to communicate is the best weapon that you have, and that'll save your life in many, many situations. I believe everyone eventually talks and gives up some kind of information. It might not be the most important information, but if you can gain a rapport with your probationer or your parolee and talk about their gang life and their activities and maybe their desire to get out of the gang and leave the gang and establish a rapport, is the more information that you're going to get. Okay. The other thing about gang members is they are conditioned to lie. So during your course of the interviews, don't get frustrated, because if they've served any time in jail or prison, they know about not wanting to tell the truth. Let's talk a little bit about officer safety and gang supervision. Be safe. You are responsible for your safety and for your life. At no time do you take shortcuts regarding your safety. You've got to know your equipment. If you have arrest capabilities, and you have to know your equipment, how to use your handcuffs, how to search properly, how to handcuff properly. You take no shortcuts, because shortcuts lead to injury and fatalities. Okay? Eliminate safety lapses and bad habits during your course of work every day. Okay? You are responsible for your own personal safety, so you must take this very, very seriously. Gang members used to use threats, fear, and intimidation against witnesses and rivals. We have today gang members using threats, fear, and intimidation against law enforcement officers. No one is immune. We've had more than one probation or parole officer threatened. We have correctional officers threatened. We have judges, prosecutors, and street cops threatened. Gang members will use threats, fear, and intimidation to back you off from doing your job. Gangs are increasingly more dangerous, and they're becoming more aggressive towards law enforcement. And that old saying, "I'll get you when I get out," is very prevalent today. They like to use that fear. Threat assessments. In the event that you do get threatened by a gang member or a gang, you need to have your department do a thorough threat assessment. What person or gang made that threat? What is their criminal background and history of threats? What is the motive or the reason for the threat? What was the person's state of mind at the time the threat was made? What is the likelihood of follow-through? Are these just empty threats that they make all the time? So you need a thorough threat assessment done in the event that you are in fact threatened. Awareness and response. Know your habits, how you do your field supervision. You don't want to get followed, and be aware of any counter surveillance. Certainly, if you do get threatened, you want to vary your route to home, to court, to work. Okay? We call that being on code yellow, being on alert at all times until the threat has dissipated. Many times, gangs will sue you as a result of maybe a special condition of parole or probation, and you'll get lured to a deposition. And we've had parole officers in civil depositions get followed from the deposition. So you need to be, if you get threatened, you need to be very, very alert on how you can go about taking care of your business. We've used cover teams when our staff have been threatened, and that's certainly something that you may not have working in a rural area. You may not have the staff to do that. But one thing you got to understand that gangs don't forget. They keep grudges for a very long time. They will check parking lots. Okay, they will break into cars and look for home addresses and garage door openers. So you've got to be very, very careful in the event that you get a threat. We've known gang members to walk through parole office parking lots and write down license plate numbers and look at license frames to see what hometown you might be. Today, you got to know your neighbors. Okay? Gangs are in our kids' schools. You're going to see them on the sports field. And databases. They can get your information through a series of databases. In fact, there's a database known as Zabas Search, Z-A-B-A search.com. If you own a home and you pay a mortgage, chances are your name will be listed with your home address. So as a result of computers, they can find you if they want to. Retaliation, gangs will retaliate, so don't personalize this business. Be professional. I won't go through the rest of those bullets because they are basically refer to a California case. But supervision, gangs listen. Loose talk. Gang members listen. Their associates and families as well. So when you're in court and you're in the hallway, no personal talk about your personal life. And if you transport or book, you have the capability of arrest powers and booking. No loose talk when transporting parolees or probationers to jail. No loose talk about where you and your colleagues live, recreate, eat, and enjoy one another. Gangs share information about staff, so be very cognizant of that. Off-duty, adapt your thinking to your off-duty practice. You live in a rural area, you're going to tend to come across gang members in your off-duty hours. So have a personal safety plan for you and your family. If a probationer or parolee confronts you in public, is angry with you, what do you want your family to do? And of course, your communication skills are the best thing that you have to de-escalate the problem and safely get you and your family out of harm's way. Certainly your home security, you want to check that as well. Okay, and some of us have developed elaborate security systems where you have a code word that if you call home and you use a particular code word, it alerts your family to a particular problem. And I don't want to overemphasize it, but supervising gang members can be very, very dangerous at times. Partnerships, you've got to form partnerships with the police for officer safety, to share information to prevent violence between gangs, to help solve crimes in the streets and inside lockups, and certainly to increase arrests of offenders and the seizure of weapons. Different types of partnerships you may be involved in: enhanced supervision, where parole and police and probation and police ride together during home visits. Certainly fugitive apprehension units where you work together, picking up absconders, information sharing, maybe a specialized enforcement partnership, maybe for gang members or sex offenders, and certainly interagency problem solving. You can also, with the police, develop information, swap information about identifying trends and patterns in your area, and certainly information on threats, and improve training for all of everybody that works in your particular rural area. And of course, community-based organizations. If we're going to fight the gangs, we're going to have to get together with community anti-gang programs and all of these bullets here: the schools, the faith-based groups, the gang members' families, sports programs, and self-help programs. Strategies for the future. We've got to talk about collaboration and more collaboration with law enforcement and community groups. Alternatives to joining gangs. More educational opportunities to educate these people that there's a better life beyond gangs. Certainly use of technology and electronic monitoring is growing very, very, very quickly in some of the larger areas and may be useful in the rural areas as well. And of course, we're always striving for smaller, specialized caseloads. Okay, these are some of the resources that are available to you. You can jot them down. There are different websites to go to. I would also like to give you my personal email address. I'm going to take some questions here in a minute. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, I believe. But my personal email address is b as in boy, .parry, and that's Parry, at sbcglobal.net. If you come up with a question in the future, just email it to me and let me know that you were an attendee at this webcast and what your question is, and I'll research it if I don't know the answer, and I'll get back to you. Pat, do we want to take some questions at this point in time?
Yes, sir, we do. We did get 3 emailed to us.
Okay.
Jane from Virginia is curious as to why the identifiers that are used by the Bloods and Crips and the People Nation and Folk Nation change from West Coast to East Coast, why one goes right on the East Coast and left on the West Coast, or vice versa.
Well, why I don't know, other than gangs continually adjust, and they also want to differentiate. Sometimes the different gang sets want to differentiate themselves from the other sets. Each gang is looking for their own identity, and so they adopt signs and symbols to their own, what they think is their own identity. And but once law enforcement begins to identify gang members as a result of those symbols, signs, and tattoos, they'll sometimes change.
I see.
Because in some prison systems, they will lock them up in management control units if they're identified gang members. So gangs continually adapt and change among themselves, and also to avoid law enforcement scrutiny.
Okay. Another question came in from the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice. She wants to know that when you're dealing with juveniles, locking them up is often causes a proliferation in the gangs. She wants to know what you would recommend investing in the upfront area that would help to turn these young people around.
I would certainly invest. In fact, I've talked to the California legislature about this on many times. Is we need to put money in the front end. You can't take a juvenile offender out of a dysfunctional family and put him into a custody setting and attempt to rehabilitate, or, for a lack of a better term, fix him, and then release that person back to the dysfunctional family and think that he's not going to fall back under the influence of the dysfunctional family or the crime-infested neighborhood. So we need to, if you're going to treat particularly juveniles in the gang arena, we need to look at the entire family. We need to treat the entire family. We need to use education, anti-crime programs, job training programs. A lot of gang members in gang-infested areas don't want to, have no desire to go to college, but they want to learn a trade. So we have to attack the problem more globally. Look at the issues of poverty, the issues of access to jobs, access to education, and we've got to treat the entire family, not just the individual juvenile.
Okay, thank you. And finally, from Wisconsin, a gentleman wants to know what the major concerns related to gangs might be in the Wisconsin area specifically.
That's a question that I'm going to write down, and I will research for that particular individual. I'm not that familiar with what is going on in Wisconsin, but I do have some contacts within Wisconsin law enforcement. So if that person would, if I can get that email address from that person, I will get back to them. I do know that we had some Asian gang members commit some violent crimes in California. They were from the Hmongs, and Hmong, and they fled to Wisconsin and Minnesota, and there was a prevalence of Hmong gangs in both those states. So I know that is beginning to become a problem in Wisconsin, but I will certainly do some research in the next couple of days and get back to that person if I could get their email address, Pat.
I'll send it to you, Brian. Thank you.
Okay.
And those are the only questions that have come in over the web.
Okay. I've got 2 minutes to 1 o'clock in West Coast time, so if there are no more questions, Pat, this concludes my presentation.
The only thing would be if the operators are holding any questioners on queue, and I don't think that they are.
And once again, if you would like to ask a question over the phone, that is *1 on your touch-tone keypad at this time. And there are no questions over the phone, sir.
Well, thank you very much for attending this conference, and I hope that you have gotten something from it. And if you want to ask some questions, I've given you my email address, and I will certainly answer every email I get. And thank you again for allowing me to do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry, for your presentation, and thanks to all who participated. Your comments about this program are very important and will assist us in planning similar trainings in the future. We ask that each attendee at your site complete the participant evaluation form and return it to Pat Bancroft at the American Probation and Parole Association as soon as possible. The mailing address and fax number are included on the evaluation form. This presentation has been recorded, and the synchronized audio teleconference webcast as well as accompanying materials will be available free on the APPA website at www.appa-net.org within 3 weeks. Please share information about this web-based training opportunity with your colleagues. This concludes our presentation. Again, thank you for your participation and have a wonderful day.
Pat, are we going to hang on for